Peace to you and welcome to New North Church. If this is your first time, bathrooms are across the hall, through the door. Parlor is down here to the right. There's a reception following the service. Okay? There'll be a quiz later on. So we have gathered to worship, to proclaim Christ crucified and risen, to remember before God our friend Philip, to give thanks for his life, to commend him to our merciful Creator, and to comfort one another in our loss. Let us give thanks for the gift of life and for the presence of the Holy One among us. That's the difference between an amplified voice and me trying to yell. Thank you. Robert?
Let us pray. God of grace and love, we remember before you this day our brother Philip. We thank you for giving him to us as a companion on our journey. In your boundless compassion, console those who mourn. Surround them with your love. Give us faith to see that death is the way to eternal peace in your presence. Watch over us when we find ourselves on the tempestuous sea of life. We pray that we may enlarge our vision to see beyond the limits of our understanding. When we find ourselves in the midst of the rough seas in life's voyage, keep us ever mindful of your presence to guide and direct us. Frail is our vessel, and wide is the ocean of life. In your compassion, set us on the right course that leads us to the safe haven of your love and mercy. This we pray in the name of the one God of us all, who is the captain of our souls, and in whose strength we find courage and comfort in time of loss. Amen.
Amen. So it's in the hymnal?
It's number 8.
No one told me that.
It's number, I'll tell you.
You should all have a red hymnal in your pew.
Number 538.
538. Hit it, Joni. Please be seated.
Hi everybody. I first of all wanted to apologize for the hymn number gate, and I was advised to look up the number several times today, and I let the ball drop on that. Anyways, I just wanted to take a moment to welcome you all and to thank everyone for coming. Every time my sister and Liz and I started making plans for this memorial service for my dad, it seemed like the COVID virus would throw us another curveball. And I can't tell you how much it means to me to finally be able to gather together to remember my dad and to see all the faces here today of family and friends who meant so much to my dad during his lifetime. We have quite a number of things planned for the service today. So many, in fact, I'm worried we may end up paying an unintended nod to the traditions of our Massachusetts Puritan ancestors. But before we begin, I just wanted to make sure to encourage everyone not to feel self-conscious if at any point you need to get up and stretch your legs, or visit the restrooms or the parlor in the back, where we'll be holding the reception following the service. And please feel free to move about the cabin, so to speak. So I wanted to start with, before we get to the first speaker, I wanted to share with you a reading from the closing paragraphs of Norman McLean's short story, A River Runs Through It. Though this passage is only 2 paragraphs, it does require a brief introduction to provide some context for those of you who may not be familiar with the full story. In the first sentence, Norman writes, "In our family, there was no clear line between religion and fly fishing. Norman grew up in western Montana during the early decades of the 20th century, where his father was a Presbyterian minister. Growing up, Sundays were given over wholly to religion. In between attending their father's morning and evening services, Norman and his brother Paul would spend an hour studying and reciting from the Westminster Shorter Catechism before heading out for a walk in the hills with their father while he unwound between services. During the rest of the week that followed, Norman writes that he and his brother probably received as many hours in instruction in fly fishing as they did in all other spiritual matters. Their father taught them the cast, which he described as an art that is performed on a 4-count rhythm between 10 and 2 o'clock. Paul, in particular, developed a gift for fishing. Norman described him as being not just a fisherman, but an artist when he was out on the water. Norman and Paul and their father often fished the Blackfoot River in western Montana. The Blackfoot was a glacial river with roots going back to the Ice Age, when, as Norman describes it, the glacial dam broke and the hydraulic monster of the hills charged down onto the plains. Norman's father felt a spiritual connection to the river. He would often note that the boulders that formed its bed and banks were Precambrian rocks from the basement of the world and time. He would point out, if you look closely enough, you could see the marks of raindrops on the boulders, remnants from an ancient rain that had spattered the mud of the riverbed before it had hardened into rocks. In his later years, Norman's father would bring a copy of the Bible he would read from while he fished the river. He would note that the book says, "The Word was in the beginning," and felt that if you listened carefully enough to the water running over the ancient rocks of the riverbed, you could hear the words, "Oldest of the old," whispering beneath it all. Now you may ask, what does this all have to do with my dad, who probably never spent a day fly fishing other than maybe on a family trip to Montana in his youth? Reading the story about the fishing trips Norman took with his brother and father has always reminded me of all the hours I spent sailing with my dad in the waters off Marblehead. We would often stay out late in the evening, returning to the morning with fading light as the sun was setting. These were peaceful hours we spent outwardly didn't share the philosophical side of Norman's father, I think this passage captures the spirit of what drew my dad to sailing into the sea and the spiritual connection he felt to the waters off Marblehead. And so finally, here's the passage in full, where Norman is remembering his father while fishing the Blackfoot Lake to the region. Of course, now I am too old to be much of a fisherman, and now, of course, I usually fish the big waters alone, although some friends think I shouldn't. Like many fly fishermen in western Montana, where the summer days were almost Arctic and lake, I often do not start fishing until the cool of the evening. There, in the Arctic half-light of the canyon, all existence fades to a being with my soul and memories, and the sounds of the big Blackfoot River, and a four-count rhythm, and the hope that a fish will rise. Eventually, all things merge into one, and a river runs through it. The river was cut by the world's great flood and runs over rocks from the basement of time. On some of the rocks are timeless raindrops. Under the rocks are the words, and some of the words are theirs. I am haunted by waters. So next, I'd like to invite up our first speaker, Mel Ellis. The Ellis families were next door neighbors and longtime family friends of my dad's family in Marblehead, where Mel and my dad spent summers together growing up. And it's really special to have Mel here with us today to share his memories of my dad. So take it away, Mel.
Good morning. Good morning. So, my friendship with Pete, as Rob was saying, goes back over 70 years, which is a crazy number. Starting when we were summertime neighbors in Marblehead, I mean right next door. Our two families formed a marvelously warm and special friendship, relationship that continues today, and it's been a great gift to us all. So what can one say about this unique fellow, Pete Tobey? That he was enthusiastic about life, about his wonderful family, about his friends, that he loved to laugh out loud, that he was sentimental beyond words, that he was self-deprecating, unfailingly polite and gracious, that he was old school. Yes, all of those things are true, but there's a lot more. Pete had impact on all of us here today, likely more than he knew, but certainly he was too modest to mention. So here's an example. When I was 5 or 6 years old, Pete was a few years my senior, and he asked me if I could spell Boston. Well, that was easy. WHTH, AM and FM, Boston. And Pete laughed out loud, but not at me. He would never do such a thing, but he laughed with the purity of that moment. So, as we all know, Pete loved to sail, and he loved everything about it. The boats, the sailors, the sport itself. His mother started to spark this interest, and she had an original Airshot 12, a beautiful little sloop that was utterly safe and unsinkable, and that's the boat that Pete learned to sail on. When he was a kid, he crewed on the Sturdy Beggar for Mr. and Mrs. Peabody, and the Sturdy was a 27-foot S-class Herreshoff sloop with a 42-foot tapered, some might call it rakish, mast, and that thing could fly. couple. They were childless, and Pete lashed himself alongside. It was a sweet, loving relationship that was lifelong, and oh, the joy of it. The enthusiastic, sentimental Pete, you bet. That's who it was. So one summer, Pete asked me if I would crew for him on his jolly boat at Marblehead Race Week. That sloop could also fly, and there were lots of boats in the competition. Racing with Pete was intense, and that's putting it mildly, and very personal. He was determined that we would do our best and bring honor to his boat. So playing by the rules mattered to Pete a lot. Woe be unto him, however, should another boat infringe the rules. That would not be cool. So I can still hear him screaming, literally screaming, with a tone reflecting both indignation and rage, "Starboard!" at a skipper who was on the port tack, and it got more colorful from there. He taught me another lesson that day. Politeness and grace can go over the side in sailboat racing. So in 1962, Pete spent the summer as a one-in volunteer in England, and when he came back, he suggested I might want to try it. So this was as kind of a service outreach project named in honor of Gilbert Leonard, who was the U.S. ambassador to the UK during the Second War. He was terrific, and the Brits loved him. So Tubby Clayton, who had been chaplain of the Queen, made this thing come about, and so Pete went, and I went the next summer, and it was a wonderful experience. 35 American students working with underprivileged youth in London's East End. It was terrific. I had a great experience. So at the end of the summer, when I met, on the first day, I met a young fellow named Craig Casey. And Craig was exactly 10 years older than I, and he took a particular interest in me. So at the end of the summer, Craig came back to Marblehead with me, and I introduced him to Pete. Well, as it turned out, Ralph Williams needed a crew on Pegasus to take his boat down east to Maine. Pete couldn't go, so he asked if Craig and I would like to go, and we said sure. So off we got on the Pegasus in a storm, and trays flying all over the cabin. We land in Maine, and Mrs. Williams took a particular like to Craig and made a point of introducing him to her daughter, Sally. And that's how Craig and Sally Casey first got together. They raised 3 beautiful children together, and we have Sarah and Ellen Casey here this morning with us. So through the Winans, Pete indirectly changed the course of the lives of Craig and Sally and impacted my own, but he was too modest ever to acknowledge his essential role. So what can one say about this wonderful, unique fellow? Pete Tobey, old school, yes he was. That he was enthusiastic about life, yes, that too. That he was sentimental and self-deprecating, no doubt. But the core of it is that Pete Tobey made the world a better place for all of us. Not bad, my friend, not bad.
Sure.
Thanks for listening, everybody. That was the reunion of our strings trio. I think we last played together at my grandmother's memorial service many years ago. So it was great to have a chance to play some music together again to remember that day too. I wanted to continue with this is an air from Scotland that was written by the Reverend William McLeod. William grew up in the village of Brockedale on the Isle of Skye, where he became a minister. In the late 1700s, he was reassigned to a parish in Argyll on the mainland, and it's said that he composed this air as he was being rowed out to the ship taking him away from Brockedale, looking back in farewell on the village and its church steeple. He named this air Sitting in the Stern of the Boat. The next speaker we want to invite up is my dad's cousin, Phip, Wheelock. It's really great to have him here with us today, too.
Pete and I were joined by our love of sailing, and Pete had a big influence. My previous history with sailing was these monstrous flat-bottomed scows on right wing, and was also prone to these horrific flying jives where the boom would, in a run, would rise up, almost touch the mast and come crashing over, and the thing would do a 360, and I was terrified of the boat. So, of course, we went to Marblehead to Peaches Point to visit the family, and I spied this boat, the Jolly Boat, which is 18 feet long, a stretched out International 14, and it looked like kind of like a cigar in the water because it was long and narrow. And I was not used to this. So when Pete took us out for sail, he hauled in the sheet and the boat accelerated. I'd never experienced anything like that in my life. I was smitten. So this boat just flew along, and just slicing through the waves. At some point, Pete suggested to my father that I might like to sail the boat. So we acquired the Jolly Boat. And the Jolly Boat at that time was very simply rigged. It had no go fast, just a sail, a aluminum and wood spar, and steel centerboard, and hiking straps, and we also had the trapeze on it, which you could hook on, and so we acquired the Jolly Boat, and that set off all kinds of great adventures for me. I think he embraced the Jolly Boat. I know Mel alluded to his rather passionate display of keeping to the rules. But how Pete described it to me was that it was more an excuse to get out on the water. Pete's main passion was the ocean. A sailboat is this moving marker, bellbuoy. It is this balance between the wind on the one hand and this transformational hull and the centerboard or keel, which connected air and the wind and the water. And at its best, it was this heroic balance. It could be blown over, it could have nowhere, but it was this balance between wind and water, and it's a way of getting into this big ocean, which has no markers, it has no stoplights. You sail by wind and water and the North Star and your own reckoning and maybe some maps. So it was in, where I mentioned the spiritual quality of sailing for Pete, and it was this because the ocean was ephemeral, it was forever, it was constantly changing, and it was huge. You felt very small in the ocean, and that was an existential part of Pete's connection with the water. So he would talk about where it used to be now. The Jolly Boat back in the day was strictly a one design. You got it as it was, you got the sails, and nothing else was allowed. And that's the way Pete liked it. He would race the Harrisock, he would go out in the Harrisock 12, his father, Philip, had a lot to do with making Harrisock 12 a flute boat. Anyway, his idea was that he would go out and he would race and maybe yell at some people, but then at the end he would come back, and it was, you would have community and you have an excuse to go out on the water. It's something to do. It was a test. If you didn't finish the race in a good position, well, that was because you had to adjust your wind and tide and look at your maps and figure out where the shallows were when the ocean was coming in with the tide and get out of the tide, or find out which way to go on the course. So it was more of a test. And what happened since, where I raced in Marblehead, and it became a development boat. So the rudder changed, the mast changed, the spinnaker changed, and we did all kinds of things to make the boat go faster. So at the time I raced it, it was all about winning. It was all about taking the boat and just going faster, faster, faster. That was not what Pete was about. Of course, he liked to do well, but his essential being on the water was a spiritual exercise, not to win. And that was a big lesson for me, because I was always jumping up and down about wanting to win, 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 win. So not only did he provide me the boat as the vehicle to learn some things about myself, but I also came to understand that he knew what was important. And the being on the water in that spiritual place was something that probably took me another 20, 30 years to understand. And I'm so thankful for Pete for giving me that opportunity.
Thanks, Phip. That was beautiful. So my sister Liz and I put together two short slideshows, and we're going to play the first of those right now. This is a brief introduction. My dad loved the music of, how are you doing? Sorry. Good gracious. My dad loved the music of Joni Mitchell, and especially the song The Circle Game. Mitchell wrote the song in 1966 for friend Neil Young, and the words speak of a young boy growing up and of the passions of time, told through the metaphor of a carousel in the chorus. When Liz and I were growing up next door to Hingham, in the town of Hull, there was an amusement park called Paragon Park, which featured both a large, old-fashioned wooden roller coaster and a beautiful antique carousel. When the park closed in 1984, the roller coaster migrated down to another park in Maryland. However, the carousel has moved just a few short blocks away and still sits to this day overlooking the beach in Hull. Our parents loved to visit there. They would bring our cousin Catherine's children, Ashley and Peyton, there in the younger days, and in later years, sometimes would visit with our family friends, the Bergerons, or just the two of them alone together. You'll notice in the slideshow that there are a lot of photos of my dad as a child in the 1940s and 1950s, and some from the 1960s and early 70s, but not many of him from the late 1970s and the late 1980s. I was laughing, reminding myself of the scene in Austin Powers movie where Austin is trying to convince Felicity to time travel with him from the 1960s to the 1990s and tells her not to worry about missing out on anything, since nothing much happens in the 1970s and 80s except for a gas shortage and a flock of seagulls. Boxes and boxes of slides and color prints in old Noble's camera shop holders. And because he was the man taking the pictures, my dad is often conspicuously absent from most of the family photos of the past few decades. And Liz again has been sorting through the photo archive that has yet to find the magic box containing the 1980s photos from the lost decade. So I'll start the slideshow in a minute. It may take me just a minute to get everything set up, and hopefully it won't take me longer than it actually takes to play the slideshow, and we'll see how this goes.
Is it up? There we go.
Thank you. Thanks again for your patience with the projector. So the next speaker is going to be Millie Allen. And Millie helped take care of my dad at home during the last few years of his life. And it's great to have her here today. Thank you, Millie.
Hello. I knew Mr. Tobey probably almost 3 years before he passed. I started taking care of him, so I didn't know all these fancy details like you guys, but he was the kindest, just, and just the smartest person I ever knew. He didn't, if there was anything that needed resolving, he was always jumping in there to help everybody, and if he explained things to you, he didn't make you feel like inferior, too stupid or anything like that. He was great. And I was saying yesterday at his funeral that we both like Blondie. So there was a movie that he absolutely loved, Mamma Mia, and he saw it repetitively a few times a day. Well, I got spared from Mamma Mia because I even preferred the war films to Mamma Mia. So I would research sailing videos on my phone and save them. And then, Mr. Tobey has some sailing videos you want to watch. And when he insisted, I had a lot of laundry to do, Mr. Tobey. I'll be back. I never really laundry. So, but he was a lot of fun, and I always loved showing my granddaughter off, and so I told him we could share her. So he would always ask me what she was doing, and she came to visit him one time, and she drew him a picture of me pushing him in the wheelchair. And to the day he passed, he didn't let anyone take that picture off the refrigerator. He loved it, and it was so sweet that way, and I just really got to care for him a lot. Sorry. Sometimes I would sing our Blondie favorites, and I sing horrible, I have an awful voice. And he would be cheering me on, yay! So I'd be dancing, and I said, Mr. Tobey, dance with me. And he's like, no, I'm in a wheelchair. I'm like, that's okay. And I took the wheelchair and I spun it around, and I moved around the house. And so we just had a lot of fun together, and he talked about the thistle a lot, his coat. And so I looked it up online and see who owned it and all but the current owner, and he was really happy about that. But I just remember most how kind he was to everyone, and how he always wanted to help and make people feel better. And I just really enjoyed my time with him. I feel like I was blessed because I take care of a lot of people, but he was different. He was very special, and he was really smart. I loved how when they had news articles from, a long time ago, he would know details that somehow didn't make it to the papers, and that was really interesting. So, I don't have a lot to say, because like I said, I knew him just a short time, and I'm super nervous right now. But I just wanted to say that he was a great guy. Thanks.
Thanks, Millie. That means a lot to us. And Millie always had a gift for making my dad laugh. So there was a lot of laughing going on at the apartment during his last years. And it's great to remember some of those times. So next we're going to invite up my cousin, Katherine Brown, who's the next speaker.
Hello, everybody. First, I want to say thank you to Liz and Ronald for letting me remember Uncle Phil today. To me, my whole life, he was always Uncle Phil. And so when I started to think about what I wanted to say today, I asked my husband Rick, who's here, because he knew Uncle Phil nearly as long as I did, actually. I believe they met in 1985, and I know that Uncle Phil would be able to tell you the exact day, time, and place, and also probably what we were all wearing. Even though Greg chose Boston College over Harvard, Uncle Phil supported him wholeheartedly his whole life. We're so grateful for that. At any rate, Greg said, think of all the adjectives that you would use to describe Uncle Phil, because they're all pretty incredible. So I did, and the first thing I came up with about Millie to actually was how kind-hearted he was. Just a gentle soul and the kindest person I think I may have met. He was thoughtful, really thoughtful, always asking about what was going on in our lives. So caring, so generous, the consummate gentleman, incredibly intelligent. When we were kids, we used to test his memory, and we would throw out a random date and time, and he would always have, a piece of history to impart to us. Never once were we able to stump him. So I kept going through words, and when I got to the word devoted, it made me stop, because that was the word that struck me the most about Uncle Phil. And so then I started to think about what he was devoted to, and certainly the first thing that came to my mind was Aucella. He was so devoted to her, and she was so devoted to him. And it worked so well because she really needed to boss him around and manage him. And he was such a gentleman that he always acquiesced. I was always in awe of their relationship. He was devoted to you, Liz, so deeply. He was so proud of you for all of your accomplishments, your book, your studies, and that was so clear, always. Rob, he's so devoted to you. And from my perspective, that devotion was really the devotion to a friend, your companion. You have had such a wonderful, special relationship. And part of that was encompassed with his devotion to Harvard athletics, especially the Harvard Yale football game, which I know you guys went to quite often. Of course, he was devoted to sailing and sailboats. That's very clear. He was also devoted to Stars, the restaurant, very much so, and known as ice cream. He was devoted to my children, Ashley and Peyton, and that was such a special thing for Greg and me. Outside of Uncle Phil would always participate in their birthdays and holidays and many trips to the carousel, which I know we will all remember so fondly. Really, I feel like my kids were so fortunate because they had not 2 but 3 sets of grandparents, really, in Aucella and Uncle Phil. So what I will miss most about Uncle Phil, we lived in Situate, and so we were close by, and we were very close by to where the Thistle was moored after Uncle Phil sold it. And so every now and then I would look up from my kitchen window and there would be Aucella and Uncle Phil in the driveway because they had to pay a visit to the Thistle and go see it in the harbor, which I loved. I'll miss his smile, I'll miss the twinkle in his eye, I'll miss him sitting at the breakfast bar in my kitchen every Christmas Eve, sneaking cookies, thinking Aucella wasn't watching, but she usually was. We called her the food police. And I'll miss, most of all, when I would tell him a story about the kids or anything that was going on in our lives, the way he would say, "Great."
thank you, Katherine, for that meant a lot to me. Especially the grade. It was really a good impression. So this is the second of the two slideshows Liz and I put together. And as Mel and Philip and Phip has already spoke so beautifully about, of course, my dad had a lifelong love of sailing, which I think he got from his mother, Martha, originally, who was a sailboat racer herself when she was a teenager. And she really passed on that love to him from an early age. And when Liz and I were growing up in the summers, my parents would often take the family up to spend the weekends with my grandparents at the house in Marblehead. Each morning, my dad would awake at dawn and head out for a sail on the Thistle while the rest of the family slept. My sister and I would awake a few hours later at a more civilized hour and head downstairs to the kitchen for breakfast. From the kitchen table, we could look out the front window towards the mooring to see if my dad had returned from the sail. And often we would see him at the mooring, furling the sails before rowing the dinghy back to the float to spend the rest of the day with the family. So I wanted to share with you a poem that is called Sea Fever that was written in 1902 by the English poet John Masefield. One of my favorite singers, Kris Delmhorst, set this poem to music. And we put together a slideshow of photos of my dad had taken over the years while sailing the Thistle in the waters off Marblehead. And in going through my dad's photographs, Liz and I noticed photos of my dad sailing the Thistle are even more rare, as he was always the one taking the pictures on the boat. So in the slideshow, you'll see a number of photos taken by my dad of family and friends out sailing on the Thistle. And I think as much as my dad loved sailing himself, he loved even more sharing the joy of sailing with others. So just give me a minute, I'll start the slideshow again. And if you want to follow along, the words to Sea Fever are printed on the interior pages of the program, the fourth and fifth page. So let's get the slides going, one sec.
Now I'd like to invite Susan Walker. One at a time.
Sirach, chapter 6, verses 14 through 17. Faithful friends are a sturdy shelter. Whoever finds one has found a treasure. Faithful friends are beyond price. No amount can balance their worth.
Faithful friends are life-saving medicine, and those who fear the Lord will find them. Those who fear the Lord will direct their friendship aright. For as they are, so are their neighbors also.
Okay, Judy.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table for me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Thank you. Now bear in mind all that you've seen and heard so far. If you want to know anything about friendship from the Bible, the book of Sirach is a good place to start. Given the way Phil lived, it's no surprise that the passage we read today was one of his favorites. No other book in the Bible deals with friendship as extensively as Sirach. Its author, Ben Sirach, was a teacher who liked to give his students advice on making and keeping friends. In the verses before today's reading, he offered some cautions about possibly being let down by our friends, but he had his reasons. In his time, today's friend could easily become tomorrow's enemy, and that is not the sign of a true friend. A true friend is faithful no matter what, as Abraham was faithful to God even when God tested him. When you find a friend like that, you've found a treasure. And that's how it was with Phil in the friends he found, and in the kind of friend Phil was to others. The joy of friendship is a gift from God. So we're celebrating two things today. First, Philip's life, and also Jesus' victory over death, that long ago event which binds us all together in faith. Death is unpredictable, it's random, and it's unavoidable. Even God said in Genesis, "My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh." Knowing that our days are numbered can spur creativity and deepen faith. Given a limited time on earth, Philip chose to live, and he chose to live a life filled with friends, true friends. The psalmist said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." We walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Wherever we start, someday we will walk through the valley and come out the other side. We walk through it. We don't stop in the middle, and we're only in the shadow of death. We all live in the hope and promise of God's kingdom. And when we walk from here to there, the psalmist says, we'll find a table prepared for us. It is Jesus who shows us the way through the valley. It may not be a straight or level way, but it leads to new life. And we will be transformed at the end of the journey. And that is the real meaning of resurrection, transformation. Jesus was crucified, died, and was raised up from the grave. On that Easter morning, none of the disciples he encountered recognized him at first. He was different. It was only in the breaking of bread that they finally saw him as the risen Christ. And it was in that moment that the disciples realized that their lives had been touched by God. And so it is for us now, and whenever we gather in peaceful fellowship, that whether we're sitting with friends, making music, or sharing time with family, we will remember Phil as father and friend by God's mercy and grace. Amen. And now, I'd like to invite everyone to rise as they are able for the unnumbered hymn called Jerusalem, which is where in the hymnal? It's in the program. Perfect. It's okay. Please be seated.
Just wanted to thank Joni again for providing the beautiful piano music today. So the words for the hymn Jerusalem come from a poem by William Blake that was written in 1804 and which was set to music by Sir Hubert Parry in 1916. Several decades later, in 1981, a line from the poem became the title to one of my dad's favorite movies, Chariots of Fire, where the hymn is sung during the memorial service scene for Harold Abrahams, which ends the film. This was a film my dad loved so much, he was willing to risk something even more than the wrath of God to see it one night, and this was the wrath of my mom. So one Sunday afternoon, this is back when I was in elementary school, my dad and I left our house in Hingham for my grandmother's house in Chestnut Hill, where we were picking up my Aunt Judy to bring her to Logan Airport for her early evening flight back to New York, after which we were under strict orders from my mom to return straight home as it was a school night for me. After seeing Judy safely off to the airport, on the way home, my dad spontaneously had the brilliant idea that now would be the perfect time to stop at the movie theater to take in another showing of Chariots of Fire. So on went the turn signal in the car, and into the movie theater parking lot we went, spending the next 2 hours reliving the legendary exploits of British runners Eric Liddell and Harold Abrahams as they ran with wings on their feet all the way to gold at the 1924 Olympics in Paris. When we finally arrived home at what seemed like the ungodly hour of 10 p.m., we discovered my mom preferred a somewhat different selection of adjectives than brilliant to discover my dad's idea to take in the late movie. I can still remember lying in my bed, listening as my mom continued to bravely weather my mom's storm of adjectives downstairs. And I don't remember what we studied at school the next day, but I will never forget that glorious evening I spent with my dad. I'd like to turn my remarks towards a more serious note. Throughout most of his life, my dad struggled with two challenges. One was the death of his father when my dad was 15 years old, and the other was living with bipolar disorder. What allowed my dad to live with these challenges was the support of family and friends, the support that all of you who are here today gave to my dad was vital mental medicine. I don't think there was anything more important in my life to my dad than family and friends, and I know how much he cherished the time he spent with all of you. My dad's last year was a bit of a strange one. On the recommendation of his doctors, he entered hospice care in early March of 2020. And due to this and the COVID virus, he spent the next 8 months in the small world of my parents' apartment. He remained the same positive, hopeful, and kind-hearted person he always was, right up until the end. I remember the day before he passed, when he was having trouble speaking, I was still able to make him laugh several times, reading him one of his childhood books, Tubby the Tuba. Which is second only to Little Toot, perhaps, in his favorites. But, however, there were often times when he felt confused. It could be simple things like not understanding why he couldn't go down to visit the dining room, or why the Harvard football season had been postponed. Other times it was more serious. When I would visit him in the evenings, we would be talking for a while, and he would say to me, "Well, we should probably get going now. I think in his head, he thought he was still in the hospital or a rehabilitation facility somewhere. And the one thing he wanted more than anything was to return home to his own bed in my parents' apartment. I would try to reassure him he was already at home in his own bed by pointing out various personal possessions in the room. There's your model of the thistle. There's the hand-drawn birthday card Liz made you of the cat boat regatta, which featured Liz's 2 cats. And there's the picture of your father in front of the house in Marblehead. And there's the doorway to Mom's old room. He would seem to be reassured by this, but often several minutes later the questions were coming in. Well, we should probably get going now. Whenever my dad had evenings like this, I would always try to steer the conversation back to the past, reliving memories and old stories, particularly from his days growing up in Marblehead and Chestnut Hill, or his days at Milton and Harvard. Though many of the people we spoke of had been gone for decades, I could almost feel them in the room with us, gathered around the bed. Once again, ready to help, comfort, and support my dad when he needed them the most, like they had done in life so many years ago. After my dad passed away, I was reflecting on how his passing, it not only meant saying goodbye to my dad, but also saying goodbye again to all of those faces from the past we had spent so many hours talking about. And while we're gathered here today to remember my dad, I also wanted to spend a minute to remember a few of these people by name. These are people my dad still talked about often and meant so much to my dad over the years, and I'm guessing meant just as much to many of you who are here today. Start with my dad's mother, Martha, and his father, Walter Philip. The Admiral, John McGregor, who was Martha's second husband after Walter Philip passed away and was a great friend of my dad for so many years. Ray and Mel Ellis, my dad's family's next door neighbors and family friends for so many years in Marblehead. George Parker, another great friend of my dad's father and the entire family from Marblehead. Robert Peabody, with whom my dad spent many hours sailing off Marblehead aboard both Thistle and Mr. Peabody's boat, the Sturdy Beggar. Ralph and Peggy Williams, my dad's family's neighbors in Chestnut Hill, and especially my dad's childhood best friend, Bert Williams, who left this world far too early. In the slideshow earlier, you saw Bert and the dinghy with my dad and with the sail. Arthur, Philip, and Walter Wheelock, and all of my dad's Wheelock cousins in Uxbridge. George and Mary Hauser, Horace Hauser, and all of my dad's Hauser cousins. Edna McLeod, who spent many years cooking for and taking care of Martha and the Admiral. She felt like part of the family. John Fitzpatrick, who took care of the garden at the Marblehead house and was caretaker for the house in the winters. My dad would always spend several minutes talking with John upon arriving and leaving on his visits to the house. And after John retired, my dad would always stop to visit John on his way home from summer days sailing in Marblehead, where John would often tell us stories about his days in the Merchant Marine. And all of our neighbors in the Bradford Western Road neighborhood in Hingham, it was a special part of my dad's life, being part of this community. And last but not least, my dad's wife, Solace. Her mother, Helen, and her father, Robert, and Helen's second husband, Eddie Day, who Helen married after Robert passed away. Eddie was a kind man, and both he and my dad shared a love of model trains. And at family gatherings, late in the night, we would often find them down in the basement, watching the trains going around. I know my dad will miss you all, and he would love to be here to speak with all of these people today. So I'd like to conclude my remarks with three of my dad's favorite humorous stories. And these are stories that were told often over the years. And I have no doubt if my dad were here today, chances are high you would have heard at least one of them at the reception afterwards. So the first story takes place during my dad's time at Milton Academy. My dad's father, Walter Philip, by all accounts, was a talented athlete who had been captain of his high school football team at Nobles back in the 11th calendar era. While my dad largely did not inherit his father's gift for athletics, my dad aspired to play on the Milton Academy football team to honor his father's memory. And as the speakers talked about earlier, my dad always talked about the importance of sportsmanship, as Phip talked about. To him, the way you played the game and the dedication you put into learning it were more important than being the most talented player on the field. And my dad stuck with it, and during his senior year, he was named as one of the starting guards on the offensive line for the varsity team. So under head coach Herbert Stokinger, the Milton team ran what was known as the Princeton single wing offense. And I'll refrain from breaking up the telestrator. But for the purposes of this story, it's enough to know that this offense involved a lot of toss sweeps to the outside, where my dad would pull from his position on the offensive line to block for the team's halfback in the flat. So that year, in October of 1957, Milton played a home game against the St. George's School from Rhode Island. The St. George's team featured a star player with a name destined for football. This was one Henry Large, and he more than lived up to his name. Sometime in the first half of the scoreless game, the ball was snapped, and the Milton quarterback tossed the ball back on a sweep to the halfback, with my dad heading out in the flat to block. And before the line could shift, Henry Large burst through the hole in the Milton line vacated by my dad and came marauding into the backfield. Like a thunderbolt, he quickly closed down on the halfback and proceeded to tackle both my dad and the halfback in one monumental arm lock. And after the whistle had blown, Henry leaned down to help them both up, and in the 1950s style of trash talking, he points and says, "Gentlemen, your huddle is over there." So later in the game, Henry, of course, would go on to score what would be the game's only points, running the halftime kickoff back a mere 90 yards for a touchdown. And Henry went on to start for Princeton in college, and later coached football and baseball at the St. Mark's School, where my cousin attended, and Greg as well, for many years, and he only retired just a few years ago. Okay, so the second story. Both of these are a little bit short. Earlier in my remarks, I mentioned my dad's great friend, George Parker, from Marblehead. By all accounts, George was quite a character. As a brief introduction, when my sister was going through my dad's vast photo archive, she came across a letter addressed to Mr. Philip H. Tobey, Philip's house, room 410, Charles Street, Boston, Massachusetts. And it was postmarked October 27, 1940. This was the address of the room at the hospital where my dad had been born just under 3 weeks before. Inside was an urgent notification which declared in large bold letters at the top, "Your name is not on the voting list," and warned that you will not be able to vote on election day, November 5th, unless you register. Liz was initially puzzled as to why my dad would have received this notification at a mere 19 days old, which even back then was still well under the legal voting age. Looking closer, however, she noticed in the small print at the bottom that the notification had been sent by the registration committee of the Ward 5 of the Republican Party and its treasurer, George A. Parker. George. He voted for FDR. So, getting back to the main story, this takes place some 18 years later when George came down from Marblehead to join my dad's family at my dad's graduation ceremony from Milton Academy. The graduation ceremony was being held outdoors in the football field, and the family was gathered in the stands waiting to start the ceremony. George was surveying the crowd, and suddenly his eyes lit up, catching sight of a man strolling towards them along the front of the bleachers. He then rubbed his hands together and exclaimed loudly, "Look, here he comes. This guy's a real stuffed shirt." And he paused for a moment, warming to his subject before continuing. "And I knew his father, and he was an even bigger stuffed shirt." Unfortunately, George passed away before I was born, and I never got a chance to meet him. However, I can still feel his larger-than-life presence through all of the stories my dad told me about him throughout the years. So finally, I'd like to conclude with one of my personal favorite stories of my dad's. Martha and the Admiral belonged to an old-fashioned social club called the Union Club, which is located in Boston on Park Street across from the Boston Common. After the Admiral had passed away, Martha had decided to give up the membership as it was too difficult for her to travel into the city anymore. However, my dad wanted to go to the club one last time for dinner, and I accompanied him being home from college on break. And when we arrived at the club, we checked in at the front desk and were waiting in the lobby at the foot of the stairs for the hostess to come down and bring us up to the dining room, which is on the second floor. Over behind the front desk to the right, there was a shallow set of stairs leading down into a small lounge room with a bar and windows which looked over the common. Suddenly, a bright-faced man came bounding up the stairway, and without any further ado, introduces himself and asks, "Would you gentlemen care to join us at the bar for some salubrious beverages?" My dad and I both stood there with identical big smiles on our faces, our shoulders starting to shake in a vain attempt to hold in the giggles that were quickly overcoming us. Fortunately, at the last moment, we were rescued by the hostess, and we were able to politely decline and head upstairs to the dining room. This became instantly a running joke between us from that day forward, and whenever we were at a family party or out to eat at a restaurant, inevitably, at some point, one of us would ask the other, "Would you care for a salubrious beverage?" So to continue this fine tradition, I would of course like to invite you all to join us in the parlor after the service for some very salubrious beverages. So my apologies again for extending my remarks to such puritanical lengths. And please feel free to send a notice of complaint to Ward 5, the Republican Party, here at George Parker. They may be able to engineer a vote to have me barred from future public speaking engagements in the state of Massachusetts. So with that final quip, I'd like to turn things over to my sister Liz, who is renowned both for eloquence, wit, and most importantly, her brevity.
I wanted to thank everybody for coming out here today, and I'm going to keep my remarks short. I was going to talk about sailing, but a lot of you already covered that. So I'm going to just say I wanted to thank, first of all, Millie and Tess and Marie and Julie and Kendra and Fran and Bianca and Jane Brady, everybody who helped take care of my dad during his last couple of years of life and made his life a lot more joyful, despite the pandemic. And to all the friends and family members who offered words of support. And anyway, one of the things that my dad and I shared was our love of popular music and folk music, and a lot of the singers that I listen to today are singers that I learned about through my dad's record collection. And a couple years ago, I decided to start taking guitar lessons. And I'm not by no means a talented guitarist, but I enjoy, learning some of the songs that my dad and I listened to together over the years. And the song that I decided to learn to play for the service, and it's actually something that I did play for my dad when he was still alive, was the song Sweet Baby James by James Taylor. And I know my dad loved this song because he would play it on repeat on the stereo again and again. But he also told me that he liked the lines about traveling the turnpike from Stockbridge to Boston. And I actually remember one time in early 1994 when my dad and I were taking my brother back to college in Ithaca, New York, and we headed back on the Mass Pike and got caught in a snowstorm with very low visibility, and we ended up having to stay overnight before we could proceed safely to Hingham. But I've always loved the song. It's actually a lullaby, but it's also, I think, a song about traveling and about being able to be alone with yourself, whether it's in a car on the road or on a horse or on a boat out on the sea. So I'm gonna go grab my guitar and sing it for you.
The words are in the back of the program. If anybody wants to jump in on the chorus, please feel free to sing along.
Our service is over. May the Lord fill you with all joy and peace and faith, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in love and hope. Amen. Go in peace.